All these exciting technologies that we will have, all of them are only possible if you have the energy that enables them. And so telling that story better so that actually the one guy or gal who doesn't want the solar panel next door has got a whole lot of other people saying, well, actually, this is going to make a lot of other things possible.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders actually are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Will Gardiner, Chief Executive Officer of Drax Group, one of the UK's largest renewable power generators and a company at the center of the country's energy transition. The company has undergone a dramatic transformation over the past decade or so, shifting from coal generation towards biomass and carbon removal technologies. Will joined Drax as Chief Financial Officer in 2015 and became CEO in 2018 after a career spanning investment banking at JP Morgan and senior finance roles at Scott. I'm curious to explore how he's leading Drax in the next phase of its transition and how the company is thinking about strategy in a rapidly evolving energy system. Will, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Thank you, Belden. Great to be here. And I hope I can say something that's of some use.
I'm sure you will. So I know Drax sort of as a power plant, and I suspect many people kind of know about it that way. But as a business, what does it do? And could you give us just sort of an overall picture of the organization today, how big it is, different parts of the business, what role it plays in the UK energy system?
No, sure. I'm happy to do that. And I think what I'd like to do, Belden, is maybe give you a little bit of the history of the company, because I think it's actually an interesting journey. And it's also an unusual company because it started out as really a single site power station that was a publicly listed business. So quite unusual when I joined, because effectively you had a lot of risk because you were concentrated in one site, and effectively the company was generating biomass. So really also very much dependent upon the government for support. And so what I've tried to do over the last 10 years is to broaden out the company and sort of create something that actually not only had more pieces to it, but also had a much more clear future. Because when I started the company, there was this idea that by the end of March of 2027, so less than a year from now, without us doing something, the company would end. Because that's when the support for the company's biomass power generation was going to stop. So what we did is we did two things. So one is we've expanded. So we've actually broadened out, and we do in two ways. Now run a lot of our own supply chain. So we make a lot of the wood pellets that deliver the biomass power generation that we generate. And we also generate power from other power stations in the UK, what we call our flexible generation or FlexGen business. So to sort of answer your question about today, so today the company is about 3,000 people. We are roughly, I think, 16 pellet plants across the southeast of the US and Western Canada. We are sort of 5 power stations in the UK. So we've got the Drax power station, which is the biggest one. And we've got Cruachan, which is a pump storage hydro facility, which effectively is there to store energy and then release it when the system needs it. We're building 3 open cycle gas turbines. As a whole, we're actually basically the 4th largest generator in the UK. We're almost renewable power. And our real sort of call it USP or our differentiator is that we are actually able to run and sort of be dispatched where the system needs us. So as opposed to wind and solar, which effectively depend on the weather, we can actually turn on and off whenever the system's needed. And so one of the things that we recognized a few years ago is that as more wind and solar gets built, there'll be a need for something to support the system. And so what we say is we like to be able to run when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Drax is there to provide security of supply for the UK. And we provide about 5 or 6% of the UK's power every year.
So that 5 or 6% number you talked about could sound small, but how much of whatever gap there is, how much does that fill? How much of a difference does that actually make?
I think it's a very big difference. There's one way to think about it is that, for example, there are certain days, for example, when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, when we might be half of the UK's renewable power. So on certain days, it can be a very big piece of the overall system. So it is absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what would you say that the purpose is? Is it really just to fill that gap, or is there something, what's the problem you're trying to solve?
It's a very good question, because I'm sort of wrestling a bit with this question at the moment. And I say that because, and again, I'll provide a little bit of history. When I first became the chief exec, I wanted to create a company that was purpose-led. We designed a purpose, which is to enable a zero carbon, lower cost energy future. And it sounds a little bit corporate, but it's fundamentally about sort of enabling the energy transition. And actually think it's been a really important part of our story. So for people actually, when we think about Drax, we're relatively small in the sort of in the world of global energy companies. But
Hmm.
actually, for people who want to come here, we're, as I said, pretty much 100% renewable power. So it's, I think, quite an attractive purpose. And I think people were attracted to the idea that we're trying to, as I would say, deliver this energy transition. But one of the things that I think is interesting in today's world is that the definition of the energy transition, sort of, as I would, maybe I'll say as was, which
Hmm.
was about getting us to net zero, I think has to change, right? Because net zero, I think, is something that now is, as a phrase, is not very positively appreciated. I mean, there's a lot of negative politics around it. And I actually think that the transition we're getting to is actually a world which is much more positive in a much more broad way. So there will be a lot more electrification. So what does that mean? That means that there'll be less smog, there will be less noise, there will be more greenery in the sense of, the cities to be cleaner, right? So not just a CO2 thing, but in a more broad sense. It would
Hmm.
also, it should be cheaper. Renewable power today is the lowest cost form of new generation pretty much in any market globally. So a renewable world should be a less expensive energy world. And it's also a world in which we're not so dependent upon imported fuels, and I will say imported fossil fuels, as we can see now from parts of the world that are not stable and are
Mm.
prone to sort of significant conflict. And that's a real problem. This energy transition, I think we should think of more broadly. The transition to a world where energy is more national, where it's more clean, where it should be less expensive, and most importantly, where it's enabling all sorts of excitement. It's enabling AI, which is going to change the way we live. It enables creation of new medicines. It enables our lives to be much more simpler and easier. There's all sorts of fun and exciting things that this energy transition is about. So if I were to describe Drax's purpose now, I think it's moving towards one where it's really about enabling the energy transition to this electrified world, which I think is going to be very exciting for all of us.
So, Will, I could hear what you said there, kind of one of two ways, and not wanting to be combative in any way, but I could hear it as that net zero stuff. We're gonna kind of not give up on it, but we're gonna admit it might take a bit longer, and maybe we never quite get there. But let's recognize the good things that are coming from the progress we're making. And I could equally hear it as, no, we haven't given up 1 inch of net zero, but we've got to find a way to communicate all the other benefits that come along with that.
It's absolutely the second, Belden. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that there's no question that climate change is a huge problem, but it's also no question that war in the Middle East is a huge problem. And so for this energy transition to get us to a world where both of those are less likely to be an issue, I think is what I'm trying to get to. And I think when the idea of net zero began, let's say about 10 years ago, the cost of renewable power was much higher than fossil generated power. And
Hmm.
the whole idea of electrification was not really on the agenda. So the idea that the world is moving in a direction that actually makes a ton of sense for reasons other than just solving climate change is, I think, a relatively new thing. And I think that the need for a new narrative, which actually is something that's exciting for the man and woman on the street, in addition to those sort of the intelligentsia, which I think is net zero is a bit of a trap now because it's perceived as being something only for the people that can afford it. And I think we need to move away from that.
Yeah. One thing to kind of pull out of that. It's something I think I've seen and heard in various other interviews I've done. And sometimes I describe it as purpose grows. You start off thinking it's about net zero, and then you realize, well, yeah, it's that, but there's all these other things. If you're trying to do good, there's almost an infinite amount of good you can try and do.
No, I get that. And I would be, again, to be very, maybe a bit more self-critical. I think that's a very positive way of putting it. But it's also, I mean, I think what we're also trying to do is more sort of akin to the question you had before, which I was trying to sort of pivot the story in a way that's more relevant to more people, in a way that actually resonates and actually allows it to be successful.
Yeah. You didn't start your career in the power sector, in the energy world. What brought you into it and then ultimately Drax?
No, another very good question. And I mean, just to give people a little bit of background, I mean, I started out as a banker. I mean, just as an aside, I was in Mexico for my holiday and had a great time for revisiting my old haunts where I began my career quite a few years ago.
Hmm.
And I've learned a lot doing that. I learned a lot about corporate finance, learned a lot about value creation, some classic things. But then decided I didn't want to be a banker, about 20 years ago. I wanted to act for 25 years ago, actually. I wanted to be sort of making decisions as opposed to helping sort of advising people on it. So I moved into industry. First as a CFO, and I moved into technology. I worked at an internet company. I worked at a semiconductor company. And again, about 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago, the company I was working at, CSR, was taken over. And I had about rough, frankly, about a year to think about what I wanted to do next. And there's two things I wanted to do. I wanted to be involved in the energy transition, right? Because I do believe passionately about the need to fight climate change, and I wanted to be involved in something where that could help. And then, sort of, sort of funny story. I was sitting at my kitchen table one sort of rainy summer morning, and I got a call from a search professional, or search for a headhunter, I guess is what we call them, who said, "Would
Hmm.
you like to go work at a power station in Yorkshire?" Hadn't been top of my list. I wasn't thinking of that. But as I did some work on it and I thought about it, actually, it made a lot of sense, right? Because it was very much at the center of the energy transition. And it also had sort of strategic challenges that I thought were really interesting, right? So as I said at the beginning, it's a single site company generating a lot of cash. So it really had an ability to do things, but didn't really have a clear strategic direction. So a company with real strengths, real challenges where I could make a difference, that's what I wanted to do.
The strategy now, if you had to sum it up, what would it be? I'm really interested in how you got to that. Was it all driven internally? Was it mostly you kind of thinking, oh, we need to do something different? How did it come about that we need to be moving in a different direction, and how'd you sort out what direction to move in?
So it's an excellent question. And I guess when I started out as the chief exec, we had a company that had sort of multiple different directions it could go. And to be honest, we've even sort of gotten involved in all of them, right? So we could have done more biomass. One of the things we did was we invested in our own supply chain. And all the things that I thought we could do had to be things where there was both A, opportunity, and B, we had a good skill set. So we knew a lot
Hmm.
of biomass, and there was an opportunity to sort of invest in our own supply chain. So we did that. We had a customer business. So we're actually, supplying energy to customers, which is a sort of different segment in the UK. And we said, we're good at that. Let's try that. So we invested in that. We bought a company doing that. We also said, well, we know we are a generator. We fundamentally are good at generation. We have, even 10 years ago, we recognized that as the system decarbonized and there was more wind and solar, that there would be more intermittency, which would drive more volatility. And with more volatility, we wanted to have exposure to that opportunity. So we bought some assets that did that. So, I mean, if you look at it from a sort of in a flattering way, shall we say, we said, let's take the opportunities that we can see, the capabilities we have, and let's invest in those. If we want to be a little bit less flattering, we could say, well, we threw spaghetti against the wall and we could see what was going to stick, right? But actually, I mean, I think in all honesty, there was lots of different ways of looking at it, and we invested in a whole series of those. But what's happened now, frankly, is that the opportunities have narrowed, I think, for two reasons. One is that the sort of the customer business, we've focused that on what we think we can do well, and we don't think there's a lot of growth there. The biomass business, frankly, I mean, it's a disappointment for me personally because I think we are very good at that and a real global leader, but there's not a lot of opportunity. The other business, which is actually generation in the UK, right, which is continuing to do what we do now, but adding more types of flexible generation. So batteries, potentially adding other types of renewables, so wind or solar, that kind of thing. So this whole energy transition, which I was describing, there's going to be a huge amount of new generation built and invested in over the next several decades. And I think we can do really well. And so one of those three streams that we started out with, I think, has now got both an area where we have capabilities and also an area where there's real opportunity.
So that all makes logical sense. I guess I'm also interested in a little bit the who said what to who. Was it the board coming to you saying, Will, I think we need to think about a few other things? Was it you maybe working with your exec team? Did somebody, did you call on outside advisors? If you had to walk me through the mechanics of it a little bit.
Yeah. So I think it's probably me mostly working with my executive team.
Hmm.
I think so. So for example, my director of strategy now, a woman named Hannah Steedman, very involved in sort of helping me think through where we would want to go. To be fair, I probably maybe short hopped or sort of caught my board by surprise on a couple times. So, for example, when we decided to buy the Scottish Power assets, there was we had Paul Sheffield, my commercial director, for example. He, maybe less than that specific one, but the idea that there was value in volatility is absolutely something that he has been sort of a big exponent of. So he's been looking for opportunities in that space. And so, but I think our shareholders, the way I think about our shareholders is that they have a clear set of parameters of what they think makes sense, but they're I would say relatively abstract. Meaning, if it's something that you're good at, convince me. If it's something that can deliver good returns, convince me. Then let's go for it. And it's an actionable thing, great. But it's sort of for us to come to them with the ideas that this is why it makes sense. So, I mean, really, it's a lot of it is about, different sort of members of my team coming to me and saying, well, here's an opportunity that we should go for. And to be honest, also building a lot of my own thinking.
It does seem to me for in an industry that sometimes is seen as very slow moving, you do a lot of stuff in a fairly short period of time. What makes the difference?
Well, it's interesting. Growing up around my dining room table, my father was actually an analyst of utility stocks. And I always remember at the time thinking that was sort of not that interesting. But actually, when he was doing it in the sort of 60s and 70s, there was still, funnily enough, sort of electrification and new capacity being built in the US. And there was interesting questions around regulation, around returns, around what you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that it was relatively, it was a great place to invest if you were looking for stable, certain returns. That was very much clear. When I started this about 10 years ago, that was arguably not it was still coming out of that phase, right? But the whole energy transition has turned the whole thing on its head, combined with AI. Yeah. And really, I think the whole idea that sort of energy and really electricity is really at the center of everything that's happening around in our economy and is a huge bottleneck now. I think is probably needs to be better understood. And it's one of the things I want to get more communicate more and talk more about and be more passionate about, because the public doesn't appreciate energy. It's something that you expect to be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for the energy industry, it's quite a tricky thing, because when you want to build a solar farm in Kent and the people that live there don't want it, it's the local council doesn't have a whole lot of arguments that they can use that resonate as to why it's a good idea. When actually this whole world that I was trying to describe of, AI, better medicine, all these, exciting technologies that we will have, all of them are only possible if you have the energy that enables them. And so telling that story better so that actually the one guy or gal who doesn't want the solar panel next door, it's got a whole lot of other people saying, well, actually, this is going to make a lot of other things possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need to tell that story much better.
And Will, when you talk about AI there, as you might imagine, that comes up in lots of conversations nowadays. But usually it comes up in the context of a tool to be used in the business and the impact it might have on what we do and pricing and employment. I'm hearing you talk about it as a new source of demand of, if we want all those benefits, that's fabulous, but we've also got to find some way to sort of feed the beast. We've got to find some way to power it all up. Or are there bits of AI that you see that you're going to use in the business going to change the way you generate power?
So the truth is, both of those things are true. I was talking to a colleague on my, this afternoon about AI. And so, for example, I think if you're a very big pharmaceutical company, for example, and you employ lots of people to do lots of intellectually high-powered work that actually Claude or whatever your model might be can do more quickly and more easily, there's a huge opportunity in AI, right? Our business is not really like that. We have really complicated problems. Like, for example, the new system we have with the government will have us running 30% of the time. And in order for us to make the most of that, we need to run the 30 highest value % of the time. Right. So if we have a good model, that actually means we'll run the 30% best hours as opposed to the 30% second best hours. That makes a huge difference, right? So there are ways that AI can help us. But from our perspective, AI is much more a driver of demand. And I think, the power demand, people might not know, in the UK has generally been flat to declining for a long, long time.
I didn't know that.
It's now expected to grow by 50% by 2035. So in the next decade, power demand is expected to grow by 50%. That's a huge shift. And if you think about the UK power system, it's already quite short of power. So people, for example, who are not necessarily big fans of biomass have asked the question, well, why is the government continuing to support Drax? One of the reasons is that if you can't really take 5% of the power off the system without it falling over. And if power demand in the next decade is going to grow by 50% more, and you think about how challenging it is to build new power stations, that's a real problem. So it's a huge source of demand. So one of the things, for example, we're doing as a company is that we're sort of working with a developer to potentially enable a data center to be built right next to the Drax power station. Right, because then it'll have its own
Yeah.
source of power, and right there we have land, we have power, we have the ability to do that. So AI and data center traffic is a huge driver of everything in power these days.
Yeah. And where does the whole issue around, the kind of queue of getting connected to the grid and all that? So is that like, so that's not really my problem. I put the power into the system. That's about people who want to get it out.
No,
Or is
it's
it,
a
that's
huge
our
problem.
problem.
It's a huge problem. And well, first of all, there are many reasons why it's difficult to connect things to the grid. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So there's a queuing problem. It's very real. So historically, it's been true that if you were a developer, you could put your project into the queue, ask the grid to give you a connection without actually having much skin in the game.
Yeah, it didn't cost you
anything. Which means that the queue is a decade long. And they're working on that. And I think there's some good work being done to fix that. A less well-known problem is that if the grid has actually given you a date, and this is a problem that we at Drax have specifically, and we've been very public about this, they don't actually commit to that date. So you don't have a contract with the national grid that says, if I don't deliver by this date, then I have to start paying you penalties. So I have 3 new power stations that I've now built that are 2 and 3 years late getting connected to the grid because the grid is not doing the connections. Now, so then you might ask me, why is that happening? Well, I think fundamentally it's a combination of the lack of contractual structure, so they have other things they want to do, lack of resources. The number of people that need to get connected to the grid has grown massively, so they don't have the people to do it. And then there's a bit of a global problem. So I was talking to a CEO of another power company who was saying that he actually had a date to get something connected, went back to the grid provider who said, we haven't actually bought the cables yet. And they said, well, I thought you were supposed to buy those 3 years ago. Well, we were trying to get a better price. Well, it was supposed to be $3 million, now it's 13. So there's all sorts of lacks of incentives, lacks of people, global supply chain challenges. All of these things are making it both more expensive and take more time.
I can imagine, just as you were talking about there, that if you're in a world where demand's going down, or maybe you think it's going to go up by a few percentage points, you sort of start sticking stuff on. The minute you think, no, it's 50% more, it's like, no, we can't just stick stuff on. We got to kind of rethink how it works.
If you look at the industry in the UK broadly, and you say, what are the strategies that people are using? Companies that have got transmission businesses, and this is again where it gets a bit arcane, where they're effectively, the earnings of those businesses are regulated by the government, and they're guaranteed a return on assets, which basically means that the more that they invest in assets, the more they grow their assets, the more money they make. So these companies that are supposed to connect us to the grid are companies of that sort. And so they have more incentive to invest and spend money than they do in actually getting us connected to the network. So there's a bit of complexity in this, in the sense that again, the incentives are not necessarily aligned in a way that actually will solve this problem.
Well, just picking up that point, it's a bit of a bee in my bonnet. Something I'm particularly interested in right now is, it seems to me that it's really, many of these problems are they're systems problems. And I don't mean just system like electrical system. They're incentives, who are the different parties, it's technically they're sometimes known as wicked problems. Nobody can even necessarily quite agree what the problem is or whose fault it is, but everybody knows it's not working the way we want it to. And it's really not clear to me how that plays out. A question for you, and I think for all senior leaders, is, what do you see your role as a leader of a big organization, an institution in the system? What's your role about addressing the systemic issues?
I think it's a very good question, Belden, because I'm currently really wrestling with this one myself. Because, and I think the answer is twofold, right? So my primary obligation is to deliver for my stakeholders. And I would say my shareholders are, to be fair, primary amongst those, but it's also my customers, my people, my purpose. All of those things are things that I need to deliver for. And for a company the size of Drax, which again is a relative, fourth or fifth, but let's say, as I said, 6% of the UK power system in terms of generation, the best way to do that is to work within that system, right? So my primary focus is work within the system, optimize the performance of the business within those constraints. Increasingly, though, I do think that there's a second piece, which is, I think that there is an opportunity for me, for other senior leaders, to play a role in helping to change the way that the industry is perceived, helping to change those rules. I mean, there's others in the space who are, have done more of that than I have, but I'm planning to do more of that, because I think, as I was saying, I think one of the big constraints in my mind is the way that people think about energy. Energy companies are just ripping us off. Energy companies are just, and it's fundamentally misses the point that actually we're enabling all of these things. it's a somewhat similar story. I remember seeing an advertisement for plastics,
Hmm.
where basically it said, everybody hates plastic, but by the way, you wouldn't have any refrigerated foods, you wouldn't have any modern medicine,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have any,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have any surgery. There's so many things. So changing the way people perceive these things, I think, is something that we need to do.
Kind of just on that, I mean, you probably have experienced directly the impact of what I'm going to say next is sort of what you said. People don't trust energy companies that, everything you're saying says we're trying to do good stuff here. And yet Drax and other energy companies just sort of get hit constantly with accusations that you're doing something bad. How do you go about building or rebuilding trust? How do you actually get that, to shift, particularly when people often don't understand the way the business works? They at a very fundamental level.
A lot of this is about how you handle criticism.
Mm.
So when something goes wrong, as it often does and often will, I think you need to be transparent, acknowledge what's not going well. I think you need to then rebuild and fix things that don't go well.
Mm.
So as my head of communications would say, people don't necessarily criticize people for the mistakes they make. They criticize people for not fixing them. And I think that's one of the things I'd like my company and people to believe in, is that actually I'm very accepting that people make mistakes, because it happens. But I think what I like to say is the winners are the ones who fix them. A lot of this is also about, caring and being recognized to care about people in the communities and the places where you work. So, for example, if I think about the Drax Power Station, it's one of, if not the largest employer in Selby, part of Yorkshire. Very well recognized as a huge employer there, big participant in the communities, and people really appreciate it and are proud of it. Being sort of central and caring in the communities where you operate is another big part of it.
Yeah, I guess that can be seen as, sort of corporate window dressing. But what I hear you saying is, no, it needs to be a genuine reflection of sort of who we are in the world.
People go down to the pub in Selby and say, look, I work at Drax and these guys, treat people well. They don't, it's not always great, because, sometimes you have to let people go, and sometimes you have to, but we understand those decisions. And when they let people go, they treat people properly, and they explain why. So for example, we are, the company will be smaller next year, because the agreement we have with the government is smaller, and we have to shape our workforce to deal with that. And so we've tried to be very clear as to why. And I think people, it's not happy for people necessarily, but at least they understand it.
Change the subject a little bit. How do you think about investing in technologies that are, they're still emerging? They're maybe not even completely proven to work, but they might be the future. They might really be important. How do you think about that? Where do you want to be in the middle of all of that?
I have sort of excitement and scars on this topic. So when I first one of the things, as I mentioned before, when I first started at Drax, one of the questions was, how could we create a long life for the power station? And one of the ideas was carbon capture. And so we spent a lot of time, quite a lot of money, investing in trialing the technology, building a plan. We got planning permission to do it, work with the government, part of all of the sort of the regulatory work that was done, a lot of involvement in lots of different ways. We actually started a company called Elimini, which was all about carbon capture. And all of this was on the back of a technology, which is, I would say, it's not that the technology is not proven, but it's not implemented globally at scale. Right? Mm-hmm. And we were, I think, very close to having a project with the UK government to actually make it all happen. And then, about 3 years ago, the tone has shifted, as you know. And this is going to be, huge amounts of money in the Biden sort of IRA environmental bill, or sort of the Inflation Reduction Act, for all of this stuff. And with the current sort of governments globally have moved way back from this. My conclusion, I think, is that for a company like the size of Drax, it's quite difficult to spend a lot of money and time and effort on something that's quite far out there. So I think we made some bets. It didn't happen. We didn't bet the farm. So I think it's all been fine. There was a reasonable amount of money we put into it. But for a company of our size, it's really about sort of being able to invest in stuff that has a visible sort of time frame. We know when we can invest. We know when we'll see the returns. And especially in a world which we're in now, where the sort of inflation is higher, capital is more expensive. So we're actually shifting from doing these bigger long-term projects to more short-term, immediately cash-generative types of things.
Yeah. I can see how that makes sense. Maybe sort of a final question. When you think about what the future looks like, sort of the next, let's say, generation in terms of energy and all. Is there any one thing you really wish leaders in the general public would be paying closer attention to?
That's a very interesting. I'll bounce off the title of the podcast, Belden, as in the Purposeful Strategist. And I think that I have been very excited about having purpose be part of our strategy. And I think that needs to be true. The world as a whole has gone through massive gyrations on this point. It was very popular 5 years ago, big backlash against it, especially in the US. And so now it's less in vogue. But I think the whole, so people need to figure out how to sort of reconcile the fact that there is no sort of one way of getting to an answer to a question. There might be a spreadsheet that says this one is 11% and this one's 10%. But there's all sorts of assumptions that go into that. And so my ask for leaders is that you find a way to make sure that as part of your, let's call it sort of risk-adjusted return analysis, that you include purposeful elements into that, right?
Yeah.
Make sure that when you think about is option A better or worse than option B, that actually the impact on the good that it might do makes a difference, right? That is an element that I think you can fit into a financial modeling exercise in a way that may take a bit, it may be less direct, but I think it's a very narrow-minded to sort of say it's all just about a spreadsheet, right? Because at the end of the day, both from a reality perspective, which is a lot more to it, but also in terms of the justification, it's absolutely fair in my mind to say, if we go option A, which has environmental consequences which are not good, that's more risky. Where if I go option B, which may have a lower return but is environmentally more positive, it's less risky. Even in a Milton Friedman world, it's a very justifiable way to go. And I think retaining purpose in a world which is where it's maybe is not as popular, I think is important.
Yeah, no, I like the way you framed that about, because as anybody who's looked at anything to do with modeling and financial analysis knows, there's always a huge amount of assumptions, often unrecognized, that go into it.
I've done a lot of work with a group called the Blueprint for Better Business. And, they've gone through these ups and downs probably more than anybody, being at the sharp end of it. But having confidence, and it's interesting because I was talking to them earlier this week, and the sort of what they're finding, for example, is that the whole world of AI comes with so many sort of moral questions, and businesses are wrestling with how do I embed those questions in my financial modeling or in my operating model or in the way I think about my business. And that needs to happen because all of us know that, AI run amok is going to be a problem, and businesses need to be part of that.
Well, and to come back to something we touched on before, how do we get those sorts of questions into the conversation that's going on in government and elsewhere about how the system works? That the incentives, the regulation, how do we get all that in? Yeah. That is probably a fantastic note, both of realism and optimism to end on.
Very good.
Will, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really glad you came to share both the, kind of the joys and the challenges of what you're trying to do there, and wish you and Drax well with it all.
Yeah, well, thank you, Belden. I appreciate it, and I'm glad to hope that was of some use, and it was an enjoyable way to spend a Friday afternoon.
Fantastic. Thanks. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.